to be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hockey Time Machine. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. Take a walk around Pacific Science Center in Seattle, and you just might run into a Triceratops adorned in the logo of the Kraken, the NHL's newest team. I'm not suggesting that Seattle's hockey legacy reaches all the way back to the Ice Age, but the Kraken are building on more than a century of local hockey history. To fill us in, we have four outstanding guests with us live. Then we'll close the program with Guile Fielder, Seattle's greatest hockey player, and a member of one of pro hockey's most exclusive clubs. Since we have roughly an hour to cover 100 years with our four guests, we're not going to try to be comprehensive. Instead, we'll hit the high points and share some of the best stories. We start at Seattle's hockey infancy with Kevin Tyson, author of When It Mattered Most, The Forgotten Story of America's First Stanley Cup and the War to End All Wars. Here's the book. Kevin, welcome to Hockey Time Machine. While the book deals largely with the Metropolitans and their championship season of 1917, as the title implies, there's the subtext of World War I. What's the importance of that connection?
It all happened at the same time, right? The first day that I did research, I realized that the U.S. declared war on Germany 6 days after the final game in the Stanley Cup championship. So it's a remarkable 6-month period of history.
In 1915, there'd be a newly built ice arena in Seattle, and that would be the place where the new team, the Metropolitans, would play. And by the way, why were they named the Metropolitans?
So they're named the Metropolitans because the Metropolitan Building Company was the organization that constructed the arena. So the University of Washington owned the property, and they contracted with the Metropolitan Building Company. And so it's essentially the first naming rights deal in North America.
You write that hockey was important as a part of a city still forging its identity. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely was. The West Coast obviously was well behind the East Coast in population and sophistication and all of those things. And certainly San Francisco was by far the biggest city on the West Coast back then, and Los Angeles and Portland and Seattle were all rapidly growing. And, Seattle has this sort of inferiority complex with California, really. And it was a city that was, had nearly tripled in population in the last 15 years. And the University of Washington football team hadn't lost a game in 8 years and hadn't won a national championship, right? It was just complete East Coast biased. And so when the Metropolitans came, it was, it was before any of the California cities had professional sports. And it was a huge feather in our cap. And for them to be as outstanding as they were and to, win a championship on the first time that they were on that stage was huge for the city.
Let's talk about the coach of that team, Pete Muldoon. An interesting character in his own right, a championship boxer, a trick skater, and Pete Muldoon wasn't even his real name.
Yeah. So his name was Linton Tracy. and he grew up in just outside of Toronto, and left school because he wanted to play baseball, and transitioned from baseball into lacrosse and boxing, and really dove headfirst into boxing and training, and was passionate about that and did really well. I mean, he was the AAU West Coast champion, and was considered the first star athlete in Seattle. And when he turned pro, things changed drastically for him. He realized that he wasn't necessarily built to be a professional boxer, and through a few good decisions, all of a sudden found himself managing a hockey team, and he was outstanding, right? He's still the youngest coach to ever win the Stanley Cup, and he was so far ahead of his time in a lot of regards, both with training, right, with getting guys back and keeping them injury free, and he was very innovative with the way that the team played. And I kind of laugh. He was a new school coach 100 years ago. I mean, he really was a player's coach, and was there for them, and they loved him and respected him. And, he made them toe the line, but those guys got better, and he's phenomenal.
It didn't hurt either that Muldoon signed 5 of the best players off the Toronto Blue Shirts.
No, not at all. Right. And the thing that's interesting about that is he is that rare coach that can take guys that are, Hall of Fame athletes and help them get better. Right. And 3 of the guys that they took from Toronto ended up being Hall of Famers, and they all spent their entire careers in Seattle. And then he took, 4 guys that had been, cut from other teams, and basically picked them up off the scrap heap and turned them into into all-stars. Right. And so he had this rare ability to get guys that needed some specific coaching and help them. And then he had the ability to really help players that were, at the top of their game still get better. So, he's a guy that you could drop in there today, and I think that he'd be one of the most successful coaches in the NHL, or any professional sport for that matter.
I like this little nugget from your book. For the first game in Metropolitans history, when the mayor dropped the puck, it wasn't a ceremonial puck drop.
Yeah. Everyone seems to love that line. So the mayor was Hiram Gill, and they had him drop the first puck, and the first thing he did was slip on the ice. And of course, back then, a ceremonial puck drop wasn't something that happened, 10 minutes before the game actually started. It was the real deal. And they had to pull him off the ice while the players went past him. It was hilarious.
Wouldn't you love to see that today?
Absolutely.
Get a politician on, drop the puck, they start playing, and if he can get off the ice, or she, great. Yeah. And if not, hey.
Absolutely.
The Seattle Times reported this, quote, "Seldom are the lovers of the puck game furnished with such soul-stirring excitement." Kevin, don't you wish they still wrote like that?
Absolutely. And the thing that's really neat too. So Royal Brome was the Seattle PI reporter, and he becomes the patriarch of the Seattle sports scene. And he's like 23, 24 years old, and the Metropolitans official scorer, and his game recaps were just spectacular. I had so much fun just diving in and reading all of them. And I do wish that they wrote like that still. It's really enjoyable.
One of the players who came from the Blue Shirts was Frank Foyston. You wrote this about him. Frank anticipated plays. He knew where everyone was on the ice at all times. He could handle the puck. He was fearless. Everything he did on the ice made those around him better. So tell me more about Frank Foyston.
You made the comment earlier that Guy Fielder is Seattle's best hockey player, and Kyle's amazing, and he's one of the absolute best athletes in this town. But Frank Foyston's by far the best hockey player from Seattle. He's Ken Griffey Jr. He's, at the very, very top of the pyramid, Lenny Wilkins of Seattle athletes, right? He just, he had that rare ability to do whatever was needed in any given moment. And, he's the guy that the first couple of years, Bernie Morris is the leading goal scorer for the team. And Frank is just like the best player, right? Frank's the MVP in 1917, and Bernie wins the overall scoring title. sets a record that was never broken, right? And the thing that's so amazing about Frank is in 1919, and I'm sorry if I am ruining something that's coming up later in the show, but Bernie gets arrested the day that the 1919 playoffs begin. And, everyone thinks the Metropolitans went from having a legitimate shot at winning the cup to no shot to even advancing out of the PCHA playoffs. And the first thing Frank does is score, 3 goals early in the game and just end the series. And he just had that ability. Whatever was needed in any moment, he was going to do it better than everyone else. He was more competitive than everyone else, more skilled than everyone else. And there's a really fun quote in there in one of the newspaper articles that said players at that time rarely went between a defender and what they called the fence at that time, right? And it just you ran the risk of getting absolutely blasted into the fence, and Frank would do it all the time. If he had an option to go back towards the center of the ice or between the fence, right, he would do it, and he had no fear, and he's that rare player, generational player.
Then there's another guy named Jack Walker and something called the hook check. What was that?
Yeah, he just would go down on a knee and come in and scoop the puck away. And Jack was a guy that, again, if you wanted to look at what a championship team looks like, this is it, right? He is a guy on just about any other roster, could be the leading scorer. And, he has this rare ability to defend. And so he's playing rover, which is a hybrid position. And, Jack's the same thing. He can score whenever he's needed, but he doesn't have the ego. He doesn't care about that. He just wants to win games. And, he was the guy that would defend the best scorer on the opposing team, and he'd shut people down. He just would take them out of the game. And, he's a guy that like he played hard and also had no fear. So Moose Johnson's the biggest player of the era, who was, usually big players aren't that fast and explosive. And Moose was the rare combination of both. And there's a amazing, scene or play of Jack chasing Moose down and basically putting himself between Moose and the goal and just getting absolutely smoked into the boards and preventing the goal, right? He just he's an amazing player. I mean, truly the Metropolitans were as well constructed of a roster as you could have even today.
Tell me about the conclusion of the 1917 pennant race and the $200 bounties that were placed both on Seattle and Vancouver.
Yeah, it's it's an interesting year, right? The season starts with huge expectations, and it's a team that's really probably not ready for those expectations, and they don't play very well at the start of the year, and they catch a huge break that Cyclone Taylor, who is the best player of that era, gets hurt, appendicitis. He's out for 6 weeks. And the Millionaires struggle for a little bit while they kind of get their footing without him. And it allows the Metropolitans to get a little bit of a lead. And then Cyclone Taylor comes back and the sprint's on, right? They have a 6-week sprint to the championship, and the Metropolitans hold them off, right? And it's the first time that it comes down to the last day. And if my memory serves, it's the only time it comes down to the last day. And the Metropolitans they do it, right? It's a situation that many teams would fold or let the other team catch them, right? I mean, the Millionaires had won the 1915 Stanley Cup, so they'd been there before. They'd done that. There was no stress on them for the first time, and you have the Metropolitans. They held them off. They did whatever they needed to do to win. And then the Millionaires are so upset that they lost, right? And the Metropolitans have to go to Portland for the last game of the year. No one can win in Portland. And they do it. They hold them off. It's a last-minute goal. Bernie Morris scores it. Place goes nuts, right? And the Millionaires are so upset. The city of Vancouver is so upset that one of their fans puts a $200 bounty on this exhibition series that's going to be played between the final game of the season and the Stanley Cup final. And then Alexander Pantages, who starts a massive movie theater chain out of Seattle, he matches the bounty.
The aforementioned Frank Foist, and you have a wonderful quote in the book about those exhibitions that were played while the Mets were waiting for Montreal to come. Quote, "We could defeat the Millionaires any day they started for money, marbles, or rusty nails." Hey, Connor McDavid and Austin Matthews don't give you quotes like that.
That's a great one. I mean, he truly, I can't say this enough. He's a guy, had he played 10 years later, would, still be unbelievably famous to this day, right? And he just played pre-radio and pre-television, and, his exploits are lost to, the ink of newspapers, relegated to microfilm. It's really too bad. But he was just an absolute amazing human being. And again, I can't say it enough, like arguably one of the best athletes to ever come out of this city, right? And coaches too. He came back and he coached in the 30s. And he just, remarkable human being. And what a way for us to start our professional sports, legacy, right? Just I've said this multiple times, the root that runs through everything that we do is hockey, and Muldoon and Foyston are at the forefront of all of that. And, it really, Foyston coached, players that went on, and, the son of one of the players ends up being the Sonics GM, right? And the best Husky basketball player of all time, right? There's a huge thread that runs through 100 years of our history that started with the Metropolitans.
So Seattle wins that final game at Portland. They take the PCHA title and a shot at the Stanley Cup against the NHA champion, Montreal. Montreal, you write, comes into Seattle with swagger. They don't even bring the Stanley Cup with them, which they're supposed to by tradition. And Montreal manager George Kennedy bluntly tells reporters, quote, "The Canadians will win without much effort." But it didn't work out that way.
No, and I don't think that was, a controversial statement with the media. I think that everybody thought that, just that there was no way the Metropolitans could keep up with the Canadians. And, again, that speaks to the heart of the Metropolitans team, right? They got hammered in the first game. It wasn't even close. They laid a huge egg and played horribly. And, most teams don't recover from that, right? Most teams, it's just, you lost, it's over. You were hoping that you could do well and praying you'd do well. And when the bell rung, you couldn't do it. And, to their credit, they completely turned it around, right? I think they outscored the Canadians like 16-3 over the last 3 games, or 18-3. It's something absurd like that, right? And again, like, they held off the 1915 Stanley Cup champions to win the PCHA, and then blasted the 1916 Stanley Cup champions to win the cup themselves, right? And it just, it's a team that had the ability to, play their best when it mattered most, and play their best when it didn't matter. Truly a championship team.
And hockey was a hot ticket for that final in Seattle.
Yeah, absolutely. It sold out within, minutes of the tickets going on sale. And, there's fun stories about, students climbing on the roof and looking through the skylights and above the transoms in the doors. And it was like they packed 2,500 people into a 1,500 seat stadium. It's something like that. It's, again, things that would never happen today with fire code issues, but it was huge. It was so popular, and it was such a monumental moment in Seattle sports history too, just to win a cup, to have a championship. And, it's interesting, when I started research, being from Seattle and not really having hockey and things like that, I had no idea if the Stanley Cup was a big deal or not, in the teens. And within seconds, it was obvious that it was a huge deal, and it was very coveted. And, there's fun quotes about even back then it being North America's best, championship trophy. And this is a really big deal for, our city and our region and West Coast hockey.
And now, as you say, spoiler alert, Seattle's Bernie Morris, who you mentioned, scores 14 goals in the final. The Mets dominate the final 3 games. Here's Bernie Morris. And Seattle wins the Stanley Cup. And as the Seattle Times lyrically writes, the lexicon of sport does not contain language adequate to describe the fervor of the fans who saw Seattle triumph last night. The crowd stood on its feet and cheered until the iron girders of the arena roof rattled as the Seattle team left the ice with the world's title safely won.
It's spectacular. I mean, it's really neat to just get in and understand that 100 years ago, how important sports were to the participants, to the community, to everybody, right? It's certainly the advent of TV and some of the equipment and things like that have changed the game, but to the participants on the ice, there's nothing different today than there was 100 years ago. And, what an achievement, right? Just to come in and battle through a lot of adversity and, really just do something magical, something that, 104 years later, people are still going to be talking about.
Kevin, we're going to invite you back when we have the whole panel joined together. But for right now, thank you so much for enlightening us about the Metropolitans and the first hockey craze in Seattle.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. To provide a broader context of pro hockey, we now invite in Eric Zweig, who's worn many sports hats as a researcher, historian, broadcaster, author, and it says on his website, hockey philosopher. Eric, what does that mean?
Well, you'd have to ask the CBC about that. That always struck me as a little highfalutin. But when they did Hockey of People's History, and I was one of the many talking heads, and they deemed us hockey philosophers. So I'll take it.
Well, you really need a pipe and a tweed jacket with elbow patches.
Yeah, I suppose.
Among your many books is Fever Season, a historical fiction centered around the 1919 Stanley Cup final between the Metropolitans and Canadiens. It's a compelling read, even for a non-young person, and a good way to learn about what was the real life tragedy of the 1919 series. And the story really starts with Lester and Frank Patrick, who founded the Pacific Coast Hockey Associations. Will you talk a little bit about the Patricks, the formation of the PCHA, and also some of the innovations that the Patricks brought to hockey?
Right. So the Patricks had grown up basically in Montreal, in the Montreal suburb of Westmount, fairly wealthy, but not, crazy rich. Big athletes, baseball in the summer, hockey in the winter. Hockey is, of course, where they ultimately become famous. Lester Patrick was 2 years older and the older brother, and made his name first. He won the Stanley Cup. He was captain of the Montreal Wanderers when they lost. Well, actually, when they won the Stanley Cup from Ottawa in 1906, he scored the key goals that won that series. 1907 with the Wanderers, they lost the Stanley Cup to Kenora and then won it back at the end of the season. And after that year, his father, who had a lumber business in Quebec, sold the business and moved out to British Columbia and basically brought Lester with him. So he went out to near Nelson, British Columbia, which is, in the Kootenay Mountains, I guess. It's not the coast. It's not Vancouver. It's not a big population the way Montreal was. And they sort of figures, well, that's it for hockey for me, but discovers that there's actually a league in that area with teams in Spokane and in Greenwood and Phoenix, small towns in this area that, especially someone from Montreal wouldn't think there'd be hockey. So he joined the Nelson team and made them really competitive. When his brother Frank comes out in 1908 with the two of them, though it's interesting that they don't really dominate the hockey scene out there, but Nelson is consistently the best team. And they talk about challenging for the Stanley Cup with Nelson, which never, it's unclear if the trustees turned them down or they just accepted them, but it never really worked out timing wise. So it never happened. And then in the 1909-10 season, this is a big turning point in hockey history, really. This is when the National Hockey Association, which will eventually become the NHL a few years later, is formed as sort of a rival. It's kind of the WHA versus the Canadian Hockey Association, which is the NHL of its time, except in this case, the WHA wins and becomes the dominant league. The NHA basically, in the small town of Renfrew, which is in the Ottawa Valley, had some very wealthy backers who had made a lot of money in lumber and railroads, and then in mining when the railroads went through northern Ontario and discovered silver up around cobalt. So they want the best team in the world in Renfrew and spend to get it. And so they bring in Frank and Lester Patrick from out west. They bring in Cyclone Taylor. They bring in Newsy Lalonde. They bring in Fred Whitcroft later. They have already in town Bert Lindsay, who's Ted Lindsay's father. And they throw what is at the time huge money around, which is why they become known as, though officially they were the Renfrew Creamery Kings, they become known as the Renfrew Millionaires for the huge salaries. I mean, Lester made $3,000, which was, about probably 3 to 5 times what the average working man would make in those days. Doctors and lawyers might make that kind of money, but your average working stiff doesn't. It's said that Renfrew spent about $16,000 on their, the 8 or 10 men who played on the team that year. Ottawa spent a ton of money. They go to war basically with the establishment Canadian Hockey Association and more or less outbid them. And the two leagues begin the season going head to head, but very quickly the CHA realizes it can't compete, and 2 of their teams jump ship and join the NHA. But then it's interesting. So after this huge, big spending year, the next year, the 1910-11 season, the NHA owners decide, we're not doing this again. That was too expensive. And they enforce a $5,000 salary cap. And that's a $5,000 salary cap for the entire team. So now, I mean, in this era, this is the 7-man era. Kevin had mentioned the Rover. 7 players essentially play the entire 60 minutes. Unless there's basically a catastrophic injury. So you can get through an entire year with 10 or 11 guys on your roster. But even at that, I mean, you could give guys $500. And in fact, in Ottawa, they more or less decided these are our 8 guys, paid them each $625, which was a big drop from the year before. So anyway, the players fight it. There's actually talk of a strike in the fall of 1910. But eventually, some of the owners talk about, well, we'll increase the salary cap to 8,000 or 10,000, but they apparently hold the line, though. By the next fall, there's all sorts of, mocking references to, well, there's a salary cap still, but people are free to ignore it as they did last year. But still, the salary cap means Renfrew can't spend that kind of money. And Frank and Lester Patrick basically decide, we're not coming all the way across the country for 3 months for the measly couple of $100 you can afford to pay us now. So they stay out in Nelson, and now again, their father once again sells the lumber business in the lumber region in British Columbia, moves the family to Victoria. Frank goes to Vancouver, and the Patricks talk about using the money. They build arenas, artificial ice rinks in Vancouver and Victoria, and are there going to build a league to rival the NHA in the East, and they form the Pacific Coast Hockey Association because they have built and owned the rinks. And the NHA still ostensibly has this salary cap. The PCHA starts outbidding the NHA for players. They can pay them more, and they do. And so again, big stars come out. Newsy Lalonde comes out that year. Old time guys too, like Tommy Phillips and Cy Griffiths from the Kenora Thistles are brought out of retirement. Lester and Frank are going to play, and they're huge stars. And so now they've created this league. And in the first year, it was there was Vancouver, Victoria, and a team in New Westminster that actually played in Vancouver. A couple years later, after a few seasons, the New Westminster team moves to Portland, Oregon. And this is the first American team in a Canadian league. And the next year, Seattle is essentially an expansion team, though, as we've heard. They raided the rosters of the Blue Shirts in Toronto, who had won the Stanley Cup in 1914. So they had a pretty good jump start on getting going. But the interesting thing is, so when the Patricks start the PCHA, the Stanley Cup in this era is essentially a challenge trophy. It's sort of like the way boxing titles are decided. If you are the champion, people who win other leagues can challenge you for the right to play. And it's interesting, in the 1911-12 season, and so many stories about this have been wrong over the years. Like if you read Trail of the Stanley Cup, and in NHL media, Stanley Cup publications for years, people would say, well, the PCHA didn't bother to challenge for the Stanley Cup that first year. But that's not true. I mean, right from the start of the season, the Patricks made it very clear that they intended for their championship team to play for the Stanley Cup. The only thing was, because they had artificial ice rinks and because it had taken a little bit longer than they thought to get them built, their season started late and ran late. So by the time the end of their schedule comes, it's already well into March. And if they're going to challenge who that happens to be the Quebec Bulldogs as the Stanley Cup champions in the East, they know that there's no chance they can get across the country with weather that will support, natural ice surfaces in Quebec. And they actually talk about, we want to play for the Cup, but we want to play it on the artificial ice rink in Boston. And it's interesting that the Stanley Cup trustees say, if Quebec wants to play it anywhere beside their home rink, it's up to them to decide if they want, but we will not allow these games to take place in the United States. This is a trophy for the Championship of Canada, and it will be contested in Canada. And it's interesting that becomes, so now the Patricks don't go. I mean, they know that they can't go across the country in time to get this in, and they cannot possibly, in a 1-game or 2-game best of 2 total goal series, they can't make enough money from their share of the gate receipts to even pay for this trip, so they don't go. And Lester Patrick seems fairly bitter about this. In the fall of 1912, he's on a scouting mission in the eastern part of Canada to bring more NHA players out to the PCHA, and he's reading all about, he was a big baseball fan, he's reading all about this great World Series that's going on in 1912 between the Red Sox and the New York Giants. And this actual best of 7 game series goes an 8th game because one of the games had gone into extra innings and it got dark and they couldn't continue. So Lester is saying, why are we as professional hockey leagues, bowing down to these trustees who run the Stanley Cup, playing these 1-game challenge series, these best 2 total goals? We can't make money like that. We want something like the World Series. We want a best of 7 or even a best of 9, he talks about. And he also talks about, while they're still rating and outpaying the NHA for players, he's talking about making peace with the leagues. And the next season, they finally do. In the fall of 1913, the Frank and Lester Patrick and the head of the NHA get together, and they write out a series of rules for how they will respect each other's contracts, who has right to what players from where. And they include a provision where their 2 league champions will meet for what they don't care if the Stanley Cup is eligible. They just want their champions to meet in what will be the Professional Hockey Championship. And it's interesting, again, that this gets wrong, too, that the Stanley Cup trustees, despite the fact that I had said, Lester's angry with them, he feels like they aren't really hockey people, but the trustees always understood that Lord Stanley had given this trophy to be the pinnacle of hockey success. And they see the writing on the wall. And when the 2 leagues agree to play this championship, regardless of whether they will be playing for the Stanley Cup or not, the trustees very soon after, like in November of 1913, are saying, no, we get it. If you're going to play this championship, we will cease this challenge sort of aspect we've had all these years, and the top professional leagues can get together and make the rules and play for the Stanley Cup. And then it's interesting that when Victoria actually goes to Toronto to play for the Stanley Cup in a best of 5 series in Toronto, suddenly there are these newspaper stories that, Victoria has failed to challenge for the Cup, and if they win, the trustees might not give them the trophy. And this is printed in newspapers all across Canada. You can see, if you Google it or check in the old newspapers, I'm always reading old newspapers, you'll see all sorts of stories about how, the trustees might not give them the Cup. They didn't challenge for it. And Lester, again, is steaming angry about this. But he knows that his brother Frank, and Emmett Quinn, the head of the NHA, have made all the arrangements and that the trustees have already cleared it. And interestingly, the only paper that same day where everybody's saying, they might not give them to him, P.D. Ross, who is one of the 2 Stanley Cup trustees and the publisher and owner of the Ottawa Free Press, his paper, or the Ottawa Journal, sorry, his paper says, quotes Foreign is saying everything was done above board. If Victoria wins, they will take the Cup with them. And a couple of papers print that sort of retraction the next year, and the next day rather. But and as I say, Charles Coleman has written, Victoria hadn't challenged them, might not have gotten the Cup if they won. It ends up Toronto sweeps them, and it's not an issue anyway. But the Cup was very much on the line. And so now, we'll fast forward a little bit. Now the PCHA has teams in Portland and teams in Seattle. This is the 1915-16 season. And their peace treaty with the NHA has kind of gone awry because both leagues keep stealing players even though they're not supposed to. So in the fall of 1915, there's a very good chance the 2 leagues are going to fall out. The Stanley Cup is going to potentially be lost as a championship trophy because they're not necessarily going to agree to play each other. And suddenly the trustees, and it's also an issue like, hey, they've got 2 teams in the United States now. What happens if one of those American teams wins? And the trustees go, no, it's always been for the championship of hockey. And if American teams win, they will be allowed to play. And I'm sure that was sort of a part of their effort to get the 2 leagues to get back on the same page. And they did. They signed a new agreement starting for 1916 that they would respect each other's contracts and they would play for the cup each year. And so this is how, and then Portland actually wins the PCHA that year and plays Montreal for the Stanley Cup. And there's no issue about it. It's an American team. If they win, they will take the Stanley Cup to the United States. And it's interesting that in 1915, Vancouver had beaten Ottawa for the Stanley Cup so handily that people really felt, well, they're playing the better brand of hockey in the PCHA. And so it's funny that Kevin was saying that when Montreal comes in 1917, Montreal expects to win, and he says, and it's true, that I think the hockey experts expected Montreal would probably win. But in 1916, they thought Portland would beat Montreal, but they didn't. Montreal won the cup. That's their first cup. And it's interesting that this is the first clear example. The 2 leagues play under slightly different rules. The NHA had eliminated the rover. The PCHA hadn't. They had different rules about forward passing, which the PCHA allowed and the NHA didn't. So it's now becoming clear that when you are the host city, and because it takes a week basically to get across the country on a train, each year the cup is held in the Eastern champions, and then the Western, and the Eastern, and the Western, and you get to play as the home team games 1, 3, and 5 under your own rules. And it's becoming clear now that having the extra game under your own rules is enough to make a difference, so that when Portland loses to Montreal, it's and then when Seattle, even though it's interesting that Seattle loses the first game under their own rules and wins the final game under NHA rules, it's becoming fairly clear that the home team has a pretty big advantage in this setup. And it keeps going. Like in 1918, Vancouver goes to Toronto wins. So that brings us to 1919. And I've been a lot of talking. Do you have anything you want to throw in or ask me, Glenn, before we get to the 1919 Cup?
Well, I am very glad that you were able to fill in with your encyclopedic knowledge, even a lot of things that the historical record didn't get right. But let me do this with you, Eric, so that we have time for our other guests.
Sure.
You've taken us up to 1919. I will have you come back with the panel and we'll pick up the discussion. But you actually answered several of the questions I was going to ask you about, the different rules and the war for players between the leagues and so on. So you were wonderful in anticipating going where I was going to ask you to go. So hang out for a few minutes and we will bring you back.
Great.
The Seattle PI, meanwhile, said this about our next guest. If you're looking for a link to the city's sporting past, Dave Eskenazi is your man. He spent a lifetime accumulating memorabilia from the Halcyon days. David, I don't know what Halcyon days are. Do you?
I assumed it's something that it's a compliment. That's as far as I went.
The PI went on to call you a one-man caretaker of Seattle sports history. Did you set out to do that, or did it kind of find you?
Kind of a combination of the two, Glenn, in that I kind of have the collecting gene in my family. And I've always been interested in history, and I'm a lifelong Seattle resident, and it just kind of grew from there.
And to prove the point, you have some show and tell for us from both 1917 and 1919. What do you have there, David?
Well, here's a scorecard from the 16-17 season of the Seattle Metropolitans, the first U.S. Stanley Cup winners, as Kevin so deftly described. And this was acquired in a blockbuster trade with one of the future panelists on the show, Jeff Obermeyer, many, many years ago.
What did you have to give up?
A real photo postcard of the same team.
Okay.
The fair trade. And then here's one from the 1919 season. Smaller, This one's against Victoria, schedule on the back. The first scorecard is the December 26, 1916 game against Vancouver. And in this game, Frank Foyston scored 5 goals. And I think Bernie Morris had 3 assists and a goal. So Kevin wasn't kidding when he was describing their abilities.
Now, in 1919, of course, that century's pandemic forced the cancellation of the Stanley Cup Finals, the rematch between Seattle and Montreal. What is it that you can tell us about that series? What was going on in the context of the pandemic?
Well, it was a great series up to that point, and it was tied 2-1, and the 6th game was simply called off because players started falling off, including a death for Montreal's bad Joe Hall. So it was bad. They, of course, wanted to continue with this great series, and even the previous games, effects were being shown from this, and it was spreading. And it certainly was tragic that this couldn't continue and this series couldn't be completed, but it was the right thing to do. Montreal offered to forfeit the series or for Seattle to be declared the winners, and they declined. And so it is the only Stanley Cup in history without a winner inscribed on the cup.
We talked about those 2 seasons. The Metropolitans went on for a few years after that. What happened to the franchise after 1919?
Yeah, they played another 4 seasons, and they made it to the Stanley Cup Finals again the next year. They beat their nemesis, Vancouver, in the playoffs in a tough 2-game series where, again, Frank Foyston kind of took the reins and scored a couple of goals in the second period of the second playoff game to clinch the playoffs and go to the Stanley Cup against Ottawa. They played well in that series in Ottawa, even though it was in March of the year and the ice conditions weren't very good. They had a couple of players lost. They had Bernie Morris back for the series, but he wasn't really in playing shape and wasn't much of a factor. But they took it to 5 games and lost that series to Ottawa. So 3 out of 4 years appearing in the Stanley Cup. They won 1, tied 1, and lost 1. And they played for another 3 seasons after that. They played competitive hockey, but their nemesis in the playoffs was always Vancouver. They didn't appear 1 year in the playoffs, and they lost a couple of other times to Vancouver. And so that was the end of the Seattle Metropolitans, as the arena lease was for 10 years with the Metropolitan Building Company, and it was deemed to be a temporary structure. And the terms of the lease were such that they had to build it into a permanent structure and completely renovate it or tear it down. So the Metropolitan Building Company took control of the lease back in the last year, and they just raised the building. They tore it down, coinciding with them building the new Olympic Hotel, and the site just simply became a parking garage. So there's nowhere to play hockey in Seattle after that point. A very successful and glorious period for the first major league hockey franchise here, and then all of a sudden, no hockey at all.
For pro hockey to return, as you say, the team would need a new place to play, and Seattle built one, the Civic Ice Arena, in 1928. Right. So the Eskimos are the new Seattle hockey team, then the Seahawks, then the Olympics. Take us through that stretch of Seattle hockey history.
Well, when the Metropolitans and the PCHA folded, Pete Muldoon went to Portland to the newly named Western Hockey League to coach the Rosebuds for the 25-26 season. The Rosebuds were then sold to a Chicago group, and they became the expansion Chicago Blackhawks for the 26-27 season. Muldoon was the coach for the first season of the Chicago Blackhawks, but was just so hectored and bothered by their owner that he resigned a couple of weeks before the season ended. And when he caught wind of the fact that the plans for the Civic Ice Arena, which started in 1925, were approved, and that structure was going to be built, He certainly wanted to come back to the Pacific Northwest and start another pro hockey franchise. He competed with another group, which was led by a guy named Wee Coyle, who was the quarterback for Gil Doby's great Washington Huskies teams in the teens that went 59-0-3. And they made Coyle the manager of the arena, but they wisely gave the franchise to Pete Muldoon and his group, which included Nate Drucksmann, who was a real renowned boxing promoter in the area, probably knew Muldoon from his boxing days, and Joe Gottstein, who would be very big in horse racing in the area for many years. And they wisely awarded the franchise and the lease to Pete Muldoon's group. And they formed the Seattle Skating and Ice Hockey Association and introduced the Pacific Coast Hockey League, which consisted of Seattle, Portland, Victoria, and Vancouver. So kind of the same nucleus as the old PCHA. And they named the team the Eskimos. They had the same color scheme as the old Mets in the red, white, and green, just a slightly different design on the logo. And so there was a nice echo of the Metropolitans with Pete Muldoon at the helm. And they started off professional hockey again for the 1928-29 season in Seattle.
You mentioned Pete Muldoon coming back. Another name from the Metropolitans' glory days, Frank Foyston, also came back as the Eskimos then gave way to the Seahawks.
Correct. Yeah, the Eskimos lasted for 3 years with a major tragedy in the middle of that, actually near the beginning, when the Pacific Coast Hockey League was intended to also have a franchise in the future in Tacoma and have California franchises. These were part of Pete Muldoon's design, but as he was scouting a location in March of 1929 with Nate Drucksmann and Hugh Caldwell, his other partner, he had a heart attack in the car and passed away suddenly, which just major sad news in Seattle and in the region. In fact, the headlines were above the fold in the Seattle PI, which is usually reserved for world leaders and and famous actors and the like. So it was a great loss. And that undeniably changed the course of the Pacific Coast Hockey League. And it was out of business by the end of the 1930-31 season. They folded due to, declining attendance and just rising expenses and the like. And so no professional hockey for the next 2 seasons. And then Hugh Caldwell, who owned the franchise along with Muldoon and the rest of the group, he decided to try with another professional franchise. So they started the Northwest Hockey League, and they named the team the Seattle Seahawks, as you can see in the photograph there. And he very wisely, as you say, hired Frank Foyston to coach the new pro team in Seattle.
And then for 1 year, they became the Olympics.
Right. They were the Seahawks from 1933 to 1939. And there'd been an ownership change or two when Hugh Caldwell sold to his law partner in 1936. And then they sold out, or Lysette sold out at the end of the 1939 season to a group of 3 Seattle businessmen. He renamed the team the Seattle Olympics. They were then back to being called the Pacific Coast Hockey League. And they had a good run in that third pro league, the Northwest and the Pacific Coast Hockey League. Ended in 1941 when the war was kind of affecting everything.
Then after the war, Seattle's next pro team, the Ironmen, and that was kind of the restart of pro hockey in Seattle, right, David?
Well, it was. They started off as an amateur team, and they were part of the City League, which I should mention because the City League started at the same time that the Pro League started in 1928. It was called the Puget Sound Amateur League, the Seattle Ice Hockey League, the Northwest Industrial Hockey League, a bunch of different names. But it was an amateur league that also played at Civic Arena and drew really well. And there was a lot of people involved in that league that were former Metropolitans and former Seahawks as well. But the Pacific Coast Hockey League that started in 1944 as an amateur league, basically there's a through line from that league all the way through the Totems that ended in the mid 1970s. So started off as an amateur league in 44-45, became a professional league in 1948-49.
I should mention that many of the photos we're looking at are through the generosity of David Eskenazi, who shares them with us as he has shared so many of his artifacts with people. But this one photo of the Ironmen, for some reason, reminds me of that awful horror movie, The Human Centipede.
Well, Glenn, I'm a little worried about you, but yeah, that's yeah, that's an apt comparison. It's a very odd photo for sure. I guess it was their attempt at an artsy photo back in 1947 there.
Or maybe there was going to be some kind of combined hockey and bobsled team.
Yeah, it looks like it. It could very well be. Maybe they did that too.
Well, your concern is well placed, David. We're going to take a few minutes for our fourth and final live guest, and then we'll bring you back. But David, thank you so much for your time and insights for right now.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Our last stop on the Seattle Hockey Magical History Tour is with Jeff Obermeyer. Jeff's books include Hockey in Seattle, Seattle Totems, and Emerald Ice. Welcome, Jeff.
Glenn, good to talk to you again.
The Totems were the last professional hockey team in Seattle prior to 2021. Tell me about the origins of the franchise.
Yeah, I think Dave kind of alluded to that with the Seattle Ironmen, who started as an amateur team in the City League in the 1940s. And they were part of the PCHL, which eventually decided to go pro in the late 40s. And the Ironmen were one of the teams that joined the league at that point and again, went professional. And then over the next few years, the name continued to change again, just like it did in the 40s. So you went from the Seattle Ironmen, they became the Seattle Bombers in the early 1950s. Then they were forced to take a year off due to some lagging attendance and some bad finances. And when they reemerged, they were the Seattle Americans in the second half of the 1950s. And then in 1959, or sorry, in 58, that ownership group kind of got narrowed down to a small group of folks, and they looked to rename the team. And initially, the plan was to name them the Seattle Jets. Obviously, we've got Boeing here in Seattle, which so the jet industry has always been a big deal here in Seattle. But newspaperman Hy Zimmerman was the one who said, no, we should be naming this team the Totems to celebrate the Native American heritage we have here in the Seattle area. And that idea stuck. And so I believe there actually is some letterhead under the name Seattle Jets that actually exists out there. But at the last minute, they made the change, called themselves the Totems, and never looked back for the next 15 or so years.
They won a championship in 59, but I want to move ahead to 63 and controversy. The Totems played a 7-game Western Hockey League final against the Seals, with all 7 games played in San Francisco. What?
Yeah, if I remember this story right, you're catching me a little bit off guard with that one, Gun. But if I remember correctly, it was tied into the World's Fair, and there was an event here in Seattle that had already booked the college or the facility here, and so the Totems found themselves without a place to play when they made it to the finals. Now, what's interesting about that is they still managed to get to a 7th game, and when that 7th game was right on the horizon, that date was open in Seattle. And so the Totems tried to get the game moved there, but at that point, the league refused and said, no, we've already sold tickets for the 7th game down here, and you guys are going to need to play this game down in California. And needless to say, they lost the series. It's kind of hard when you got to play all 7 games on the road, which would be something unheard of today. So yeah, it's one of those weird things that happens in minor league sports sometimes.
You were exactly on point. The Ice Follies and Oral Roberts had Mercer Arena booked for shows.
Yeah, it's quite the double bill.
The Seattle Coliseum then opened in 1964 with 12,700 seats for hockey. So that was a big move up, wasn't it, from the Civic Arena?
Sure. I mean, the Civic Arena, I think, held about 4,100 fans. Ironically, the Civic Arena is where I probably started watching my first hockey games when I started following the Thunderbirds in the early 1990s. So that arena had been around for 70 years at that point. It was notorious for having completely square corners. It was a horseshoe shape inside, so there was one end that was just a big bay door that would open up right behind the goal net. So opening a coliseum like the Coliseum was a really big benefit for the city of Seattle. Now all of a sudden you've got this big facility, holds 12,700 people. It was built for the World's Fair, and actually the first sporting event that was played in it was an exhibition between the Totems and the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1964. And yeah, it became the home of the Totems after that. Definitely a step up, a big facility. There were some times, I'm sure, as the team moved into the early to mid 70s, they might have wished for the closer confines of the Mercer Street Arena as attendance started to drop. By 73, 74, 75, you're seeing reports of 1,700 fans in that Coliseum, which really just had to be a tough environment to watch a game in when there's only 1,700 people in an arena that holds over 12,000.
Certainly, but back in their heyday, 66, 67, the Totems were known as the Jolly Green Giants. Now, was that because they put their hands on their hips and went, ho, ho, ho?
No, I don't think there was a lot of canned vegetables that were involved in that, but at the start of the 66 season, they had switched jersey styles. They used to have prior to that, they'd had a style of jersey that just had totems across the front diagonally. They switched to a green jersey with a Native American totem logo on it. And it was a combination of the fact that they had these green jerseys, but then also they had a blue line that was absolutely enormous. They were really a very, very physical team. You had Don Ward, Pat Quinn was on that team, Noel Picard. And then if that wasn't bad enough, you had Earl Heiskala as a forward who was notorious for racking up penalty minutes like nobody's business. And so it was a very, very physical team. And they really kind of manhandled the opposition and on their way to a championship in 67.
The next year, in Game 2 of the WHL playoffs against the Portland Buckaroos, yes, the Buckaroos,
That's right.
the Totems made one of the greatest comebacks in playoff finals history. What do you know about that game?
Well, if I recall correctly, they were down 6-2 in that game, and I believe they were down 6-2 at the start of the third period. There actually is audio of that third period that someone recorded off the radio, some intrepid soul with their tape recorder sitting next to it, and it was quite the comeback. Obviously, you don't expect a team to come back from 4 goals in a third period, especially in a playoff game. And Portland was no slouch of a team. I mean, Portland was always contending for the WHL championship. 2 of those goals came right at the very end. It was, very climactic, very exciting, and of course, then the Totems went on to seal the deal and clinch the championship.
In December of 72 and January of 74, the Totems played high-profile exhibition games against the Soviet national team. And I want to concentrate on the 74 game because this, to me, is nutty. The Russians hadn't planned to play some of their best players. And then what happened?
Yeah, so they had not suited their entire first line. The Russians were notorious at that in that time period that they had 5 players that played together as one line. So whereas a lot of your NHL teams, you'd have your 3 forwards, you'd have your 2 defensemen. They would tend to play together as individual units. In the Russian school of hockey, it was always the 3 forwards and the 2 defensemen played together all the time. So everything was always a 5-man line change. You were never changing out just your forwards or your defensemen, and they did not suit up their top line for that game. They had been through the WHL 2 years prior, as you'd mentioned, and had easily swept everybody. The games weren't even close for the most part. And the Totems at that point they weren't world beaters. They were an average run-of-the-mill mid-tier WHL team. And when they started playing well and putting some pucks in the net, the Russians got very upset. They were certainly upset with some of the officiating as well. It was a chippy game, and I believe they ended up suiting up that line. They brought those guys into the locker room after the intermission and got them suited up to put them on the ice because there was no way that the Russian juggernaut was going to get beat by some podunk minor league team up in the Northwest. And lo and behold, the Totems held on. They played a really good game, and they stuck it to them, and they beat the Russian national team, which is really a tremendous accomplishment.
And there was another exhibition with a Czechoslovakian team, and it had some of the same vibe, didn't it, as the later on 76 game that the Flyers played against the Soviet team, because the Totems were kind of roughing them up, and the Czechs maybe weren't going to come out for the third period.
Yeah, the Czechs were not pleased with the physical nature of the game, and it was a pretty close game at that point. But they refused to come. Well, initially they refused to come out for the third period until they were informed that they would not be getting their check to pay them for the game. And hard currency being as important as it was back behind the Iron Curtain, that seemed to be enough to convince the Czechs to actually come out and finish the game.
Let me throw some Seattle hockey names at you. I don't know if this is a record for any athlete in any sport, but Rudy Fillion played for 4 different hockey teams in the same city. And we should mention Rudy was much more important than just a footnote like that.
Yeah, Rudy is the one common thread that goes all the way from the Ironmen to the Bombers to the Americans to the Totems. Just a tremendous gentleman. Scored a lot of points, a lot of assists, a lot of goals. Almost every single season in Rudy's career, he had less than 10 penalty minutes. He was a guy who was never in the penalty box. There was one notable exception, though, and I'm going to draw a blank on the actual year, but in the mid-50s, he had a season where he actually had 23 penalty minutes. And when I first saw that in the stats, I was really kind of taken aback, because obviously there's a 5-minute major in there somewhere. And sure enough, Rudy apparently got into a 3-minute brawl with somebody during one of the games that year, which really, knowing what I know about Rudy Fillion, I would really love to have been able to ask him what that was about, because I can only imagine what it would have taken to push him that far to get into a huge 3-minute brawl like that. But just a tremendous player, tremendous personality, very popular here in Seattle.
Let me bring up another couple of names, not well known, but important historically. Alf and Bill were their first names, and they didn't actually play in regular season games for the Totems, but there is a photo we're going to put up, and it becomes obvious why. In 1953, Alf Lucy and Bill Geary were important names in hockey history. What can you share with us about them?
A little bit. So they were Frank Doughton, who was the owner and manager of the Seattle Bombers at that time, invited Alf and Bill to skate with the team in preseason with hopes of making the team. And certainly it was remarked on in the press, because a couple of African American players was really something very, very unusual, especially in a place like Seattle. Maybe not as unusual in Quebec or in Montreal or Toronto, but here on the West Coast, that was just something that was kind of a very big surprise to everyone. Both gentlemen were able to play in the preseason exhibition game against the New York Rangers, and I think one of them made another preseason appearance, but unfortunately, neither one of them actually made the team, which is kind of too bad. It wouldn't be until 1992 then that Seattle actually got its first African American hockey player to play in a regulation game, when Doug Bonner played in goal for the Thunderbirds.
Laura Evans, behind the scenes, if you would bring David and Eric back in. I think we've lost Kevin, but Kevin is back with us. So let's bring everybody back, all 5, and just spend our last few minutes. Kevin, I want to ask you first, who were the Hockeyettes?
That's a good question. So, there was a female team that was in Seattle in the 1916s and 17s, and I think their team was the Vapes a few years later. And there were female hockey teams throughout in Vancouver also. So it was something that was important to the Patricks, and Muldoon loved coaching the team, and that's Jack Walker right there. And it was fantastic. It was, they played a few games, and it was covered in the newspapers. It was great.
I loved what you uncovered from the Seattle Times, quote, "With characteristic disregard of tradition, women have become adept at one of the most virile games in the world. The Times was further won over after watching a women's game that, quote, demonstrated to the skeptical that women can play the ice game just as well as they can vote. and do other things supposedly out of their sphere.
Yeah, I mean, it's right at the height of the suffrage movement too, and so it was, a huge national story, and it's just a few years away from, I think it's the 19th Amendment that's passed, and I could have gotten that one wrong, but yeah, it was great. That's Royal Brome right there writing.
Okay, Kevin, one other thing from reading your book. Boy, were the Portland Rosebuds whiners. In one game, they wanted to use a second referee, and in another game, to protest a non-call against Seattle, quote, Portland manager Frank Scott was out on the ice with a whistle in his mouth. Now, that must be like a dream come true. I'm sure all coaches would like to have their own whistle and be able to call penalties.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of those things that we all laughed about as it was uncovered. It's incredible to think that actually happened in a game. And, the officials didn't even know what to do, right? They essentially just called a do-over, but it took them a few minutes to sort through it and figure it out. And, it was just as absurd then as it is today. And, I think that the rivalry between Oregon and Washington's just as strong and, not very nice, just like like it was back then. It was, intensely competitive, and, fortunately for us, we were the better team.
Eric, we didn't get to the end of your story about the PCHA and the WHA or the NHA. So too many letters for me. So it's an alphabet soup. But what else can you tell us to put a bow on that time period?
Well, of course, it's funny. By 1919, it's the NHL. The NHA is reformed as the NHL for the 1917-18 season, and they continued the relationship with the PCHA right through till, as David said, when the rink is sold and torn down and becomes a parking lot, the PCHA sort of gives up, and Frank and Lester take their teams in Victoria and Vancouver and join with a prairie league with teams in Saskatchewan and in Calgary and in Edmonton, and the Western Canada Hockey League. So Victoria and Vancouver go there, and the relationship continues with the NHL playing for the Stanley Cup until, and David touched on this a little bit too, until after 26, the Western League, they realize the Eastern, now that the NHL has expanded into the United States, the markets are too big in the East for the West to really keep up, and the players are sold to form basically they become the Detroit Red Wings, the Chicago Blackhawks, and the New York Rangers. And then it's at that point in 1927 when the NHL sort of takes control of the Stanley Cup and haven't given it up.
David, Bill McFarland is an important name from hockey history here in Seattle, and he went on to be an executive with the WHA. What was his importance to the Seattle hockey scene?
Oh, he was incredibly important in all of his roles. He'd come off a couple of championships at the University of Michigan, NCAA championships, went to Edmonton, and came here to Seattle with the Americans, and was just a great all-around player, and really a great teammate as well, and just a huge scorer. He was the MVP in the WHL in 1961 had 46 goals that year, and just a real glue on that team, and just a great forward, great player all around, and teaming up with all the other guys that came over that formed the nucleus of those great Totems teams. He was just great as a player. And then when he took over as the coach of the team, that was the cherry on top as far as their championships, their last couple of championships. And then going into a management role, he was also very important. And he's connected to hockey way back as well, in that Vince Abbey, part of the ownership group, he actually clerked for him when he was going to law school and getting his law degree. So he was quite a Renaissance man. And then, of course, he was part of the group that tried to get the NHL franchise here in the early 90s with Bill Ackerley. So he literally did everything except drive the bus, and was very well liked and well regarded. And a tough SOB on the ice too.
Well, since you mentioned Vince Abbey, let's go there and talk about the two previous occasions that Seattle seemed this close to an NHL franchise. The Totems owner, Vince Abbey, you see here, was actually awarded an expansion team by the league, which was supposed to start playing in 1976. But Jeff, in the foreword to your book, Abbey himself wrote, quote, "Seattle was continuously frustrated by the deceit and dishonest dealings of the NHL." What was he referring to?
Well, as you can tell, Vince was trying to be very diplomatic with his language there. He was really trying to keep it, really trying to keep things on the up and up there. But it's funny because if I had talked to Vince a number of times about the experience of trying to get the NHL franchise, and certainly I've done some research on it as well. And well, there's a lot of stuff that was written in the papers, and what actually happened is really tough to tell. If you ask people that were in the NHL, they would say that Seattle never wrote the check. They never brought the money to the table. Vince indicates that money was never the trouble, and that really there was a grudge against him in particular, held by some folks associated with the NHL, and they really didn't want him in the league. At the end, there was even talk about buying the Pittsburgh Penguins, who went into bankruptcy for a period of time, where the NHL couldn't block because it went to the courts. But eventually, it all ended up falling apart into a whole bunch of really ugly litigation that went on all the way through the mid 1980s and made it all the way to the steps of the United States Supreme Court, before they kicked it back down to the lower federal courts for an ultimate decision. And the courts found that in their opinion that the NHL monopoly really did not. But basically what they were trying to say is that, well, the Abbey Group wanted to join the monopoly. So the monopoly wasn't really technically preventing them from competing and forming their own league. They just wouldn't let them come play, which is sort of an interesting way to defend a monopoly. I'm not entirely sure about that. But yeah, so that litigation went on for a long period of time. And then in the second effort to bring in an NHL team here was in the early 90s, the year that Ottawa and I believe Tampa Bay got their teams. And as Dave mentioned, Bill McFarland was part of that group that attempted to bring a team, got all the way to the point of actually doing their presentation in front of the Board of Governors. And according to the articles in the Seattle Times and other sources who shall remain nameless, the Ackerley family who held the expansion bid actually withdrew it at the last minute, and said they claimed that they didn't feel like the group had the money together. If you'd ask Bill McFarland, he had some different opinions about it than that. His language may be a little bit more guarded than Vince Abbey's was in the forward of my book, but they were this close. It was a razor thin margin. Everyone thought that Seattle was a shoo-in for it. At that point, the Seattle Thunderbirds had been drawing over 10,000 fans a game at the Coliseum for junior hockey. So clearly Seattle had the hockey bug, and there was interest in the town. And once again, we had victory grabbed from the jaws of defeat.
David, what do you
got
think?
That backwards, but.
Well, whatever it was, it got grabbed away from Seattle. David, do you think that sabotage was involved? I mean, the son of the owner of the Supersonics, Barry Ackerley, his son, Bill, made a solo presentation, and then it was all over.
Yeah, it sure seems like in a case of Occam's razor here being the explanation. That's the simplest explanation, that he wanted to speak to the governors by himself and left Chris Larson and Bill McFarland sitting in the other room. He said he just wanted to chat with them for a few minutes first. Then he withdrew the bid and left out the back door and left them sitting there. And so sure seems to be sabotage.
David, let me give you the last word here on our panel before we play the Guile Fielder interview. In 2018, you wrote, "The embrace for a sport whose competitive peak was reached 101 years ago is unknown." So has that question now been answered about Seattle's hockey potential, or do you think the jury will remain out for a few more years?
I think the early returns are in, and they're very, very positive. It's still very early, and the team hasn't been just lighting the world on fire on the ice, but the fan interest and enthusiasm and support seems to be 100% there.
Guys, this has been fabulous. I want to thank all of you, all four of you, so much for sharing your insights, your time, your stories, your photos, your books. You've all been so generous, and we are all more educated and better off for having you here. So once again, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Glenn.
One name we haven't spent a lot of time on yet is the greatest player, or maybe the second greatest player in Seattle hockey history, and just a great player, period, Guile Fielder. We're going to play an interview now recorded with Guile at his home in Arizona. But first, Paul Patsku provided a feature clip of Guile during a call-up with the Red Wings in the 50s, and it shows the not-so-glamorous off-ice life of a hockey player in the 1950s.
George Strait and Guile Fielder made a date to meet Tommy Burton and Billy McCreary under the club. And here they come. They're all in the Detroit lineup. You know, part of being in the NHL is figuring out what to do with the mornings and the afternoons. Well, you can only look at fieldwork so long. Or holes in the ground. Now, listen better. You know, women aren't the only people who like looking at clothes. But here's the old standby, sitting in the hotel lobby. McCreary, 22, last year was with Edmonton. 13-21, also up from the Flyers. Fielder had 33 goals with Seattle last year. Now, Strait was also with the Edmonton Flyers, a Detroit farm club. Official end of loafing. It's mealtime. And Detroit coach Jimmy Skinner hustles the boys off to the dining room for their steak. A rest means reading or watching TV or both. And some players write letters as Guile Fielder would do. Phone? Someone to wish good luck or to ask for tickets.
Todd Leiweke, president of the Seattle Kraken, said this about our next guest. Guile was the indisputable headliner for Seattle's golden era of hockey. Guile, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I appreciate it.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
So, Guile, you were in a very select club. The members are Gordie Howe, Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, Jaromir Jagr, and Guile Fielder. What do those five hockey players have in common?
Well, I think they're all players that have scored over 2,000 points.
That's quite a club.
Yes, it is. And although I like to state that I think that I was the first one to score the 2,000 points. The rest of them came up later.
Indeed, you were. And your career numbers are staggering. 22 years, 1,496 pro games played, plus another 116 in the playoffs, 463 goals, 1,574 assists, 2,037 total points. When did you start to become aware that you were putting up such enormous numbers?
Well, it was probably my last year in Seattle, and then I played 2.5, 3 years after that in Salt Lake City and Portland. But also, I like to mention that I think that I was the only American-born hockey player that has scored over 2,000 points also.
What was the secret of staying healthy enough to play 22 years? And also, what was the secret to having the desire to play that long?
Well, I didn't know anything else. I just love to play hockey, and I was very fortunate to play on a lot of good teams with a lot of good players. It's a team sport, and I was just trying to do the best of my ability at the time.
And another secret to your longevity was undoubtedly the big cigars, right?
Well, that, and I was very fortunate. I never had a weight problem my whole career, so that helped a lot also.
What's that like? Not having a weight problem?
Well, I don't know now because I put it on since I retired, I'll tell you that.
Growing up in Saskatchewan youth hockey, you had a buddy who was a goalie who turned out to be a pretty good player too. Whatever happened to him?
You mean Glenn Hall?
Right.
Well, he went on to the National League, and he had many incredible years up there, and I think he won a few Stanley Cups. But I played Pee Wee against Glenn, and we made a road trip over to Humboldt, where he lived, and I think I stayed with him and his family. And we got to know one another way back then. But since he went to the National League, although he did play in the Western League in Edmonton, I believe, a year or two, but then he went to the National League, and we kind of lost contact. But he does live in Edmonton, I believe, somewhere on a farm or a ranch, something like that.
You've probably heard that much later, Glenn Hall compared you to another pretty good hockey player.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, he said, when asked, who does Wayne Gretzky remind you of? He said, Guile Fielder.
Really? Well, I'd like to talk to Glenn and give him a compliment, tell him thank you for that. That's very, very nice.
It's a compliment to Wayne, too.
You bet.
Now, here's something you said about your teenage years. When I was 14 or 15, the principal said I was never going to get out of grade 8, that I should forget about the books and go play hockey for a living. And that suited me just fine. Now, first of all, that's a little bit of a harsh assessment from a school principal, isn't it?
Well, no, he was he was a great principal for the public school, because he insisted we always played sports on recess, and then July the 1st, we always had a big day with all kinds of sports, and he almost insisted you try and play the one sport or another just to see whether you liked it or not. So I tried them all. I played baseball and I played hockey. And I ended up, a fellow that used to coach our senior team there, Punch Tabac, I believe was his name, and I used to watch him. He was a very good hockey player, but he would never shoot the puck. He'd always be stick handling and going around and deke the goalie out and all that, and I kind of fancied my style after him, but it paid off all right, but I wish I'd have shot more. I didn't have a very good shot, but anyway, it turned out to be the best. I had a long and prosperous career.
You were a standout as far back as your junior days with Lethbridge in 1949-50, 47 goals, 58 assists, and the Western Canadian Major Junior League Most Valuable Player. Now, I know we're going way, way back, so maybe this isn't fair, but what do you remember about your junior days?
Well, I had 4 years of junior. I played 2 years in Prince Albert, and then I ended up my last 2 years in Lethbridge. And each league was each team was in a different league, and the advanced one was in Lethbridge my last 2 years of junior. And I just played the game to the best of my ability, and fortunately, I played with some good teammates and whatnot. And we had a very good general manager there, Ed Bruchet. He was a great guy, and he took very good care of me. And I enjoyed my last 2 years in Lethbridge.
The co-author of your book, Jim Van Tour, said, quote, he came to the pro ranks with a bad boy reputation. Now, why would he say that?
Well, you know how rumors get started. And I used to like to have my beer like everybody else, but I guess I went in the wrong bars or whatever and was seen in there, and I had a beer or two and I left. But once a rumor gets started, it expand on it, and it gets worse as it goes along. I didn't really appreciate that, but nobody paid any attention to me personally wise, so I got stuck with it.
Did it have anything to do with the fact that when you didn't agree with a coach or someone else, you would say so and give your reasons, but players weren't supposed to express opinions?
Well, yes, one example was my first year in Lethbridge. The coach, Scotty Monroe, I believe at that time, we were on the ice and we were having line rushes. And he says to the centerman, he says, now we're going to take the line rushes and against two defensemen and the goalie. And he says, you take it across the blue line and shoot it in, and the wingers will go get it. So I did that. I went down there, but I didn't shoot it in. And I stick-handled around, made a play, one of my wingers, and he went in and scored. I came back, and he just gave me hell, and he hauled off with his glove on, fortunately, and punched me in the face and knocked me on my butt. I said, well, I don't need this crap, so I went back to Prince Albert. But that was the only time that I had any discrepancies against any coaches or whatever. I just didn't. I don't like that dump and chase. I got the puck. If you want it, come and get it.
Here's a neat trick you pulled. You were named Rookie of the Year 2 years in a row, in 1951 in the Pacific Coast League and in 1952 in the American League. So go back and tell us, why was it more common for players to switch teams and leagues back then?
Well, at that time, I belonged to the Chicago Blackhawks, so you go where they tell you to go. I'm sorry. The first year I was in New Westminster, Kenny McKenzie bought me from Chicago, and I played my first year there. And then I believe Detroit picked me up and sent me and a few other guys. I ended up actually in Edmonton, but I didn't get along with Mr. Poyle, so he sent me to St. Louis, and that's how it came about.
When you say you didn't see eye to eye with him, what was that about?
Where, in Edmonton?
With Bud Poyle.
Yeah, well, we had a big team meeting, and he says, now, you guys, I know you're going to have your beers and whatnot. He says, don't be out hanging around in the main bars. Go away and hide and have your beer. So, unfortunately, that was the very start of the year, and some friends of mine from my hometown came into town to see me play and watch games. And we were in our own room having our beers and whatnot, but apparently he was right next door. And so he heard all the noise and the stuff that went on. And so a day or two later, I was on my way to St. Louis.
You played in the NHL on 4 separate occasions for 15 games total. In 50-51, 3 games with Chicago. In 52-53, 4 playoff games with Detroit. In 53-54, 2 playoff games with Boston. And finally, in 57-58, half a dozen games back with the Red Wings.
And it's Fielder of Detroit going back of his own net. He's a newcomer from Western Canada, the leading scorer in the Western Hockey League. Fielder is at center ice for Detroit with Howe, the big gun for Detroit, and Wilson on the left wing. Fielder passed to Howe in front there, but he backhanded a pass, and the Leafs are floundering a bit under pressure. Here's Ribel getting a chance. He scores! A shot from the right side.
Do you feel, looking back on it, like you ever actually got a fair shot?
Well, to be truthful, I don't. I'll tell you, the best shot I had was in 57 with Detroit when we had our line of Ray Konasowicz and Val Fontaine, and we had a great season in Seattle, and we all went up. We all belonged to Detroit, and we went up to to work out in training camp and whatnot, but I never got to play with those guys. I played with Howe and Johnny Wilson, and I went through training camp and a couple of exhibition games and a few regular season games, and I just didn't realize the chance that I had or the opportunity that I had in Detroit. I don't think I give it my best effort.
Well, somebody who agrees that you deserved more of a shot was Don Cherry, who wrote this. I'm often asked, in all your career in the minor leagues, what player should have been in the NHL? And his answer, again quoting, the one guy who got the biggest shaft was a nifty player called Guile Fielder. So what I have read is that the major league clubs didn't necessarily know how to exploit your skills.
Well, that's a possibility, but back then, you know, there was only 6 teams in the National League, and it was a pretty tough lineup to crack. If you didn't, when you had your chance, if you didn't make the best of it and didn't show what you might be able to do, you weren't around very long. So they'd ship you back to the minors like they did with me. I just blame it on myself. I just didn't realize the opportunity that I had, because I loved hockey and I just loved to play. And I started sitting on the bench in Detroit after the 6 games, and I told Jack, I said, listen, I came here to play hockey, not sit on the bench. I said, if you're not going to play me, please get rid of me, send me back to Seattle or wherever, because anybody can sit on the bench, and I just love to play. So I wanted to give it my best shot, and it didn't work, apparently.
You're talking about Detroit boss Jack Adams.
Right.
And you had a couple of conversations with him.
Yeah, I went in before that, and I asked Jack to get rid of me, and he says, no, listen, stick around for a while. I'll give you a $500 raise. Now I'm making $8,000. I wasn't there for the money. I mean, I was, but I didn't go in to get a raise. I just wanted to play hockey. But it ended up, I went in the second time, and that's when I told him that if I'm not going to play or sit on the bench, please just get rid of me. So 2 days later, I was on my way to Seattle.
Your first stint in Detroit, your line mates were Gordie Howe and Ted Lindsay. And wasn't the problem that there's only one puck and you really needed more than one?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that. But I don't know that I ever played with Ted Lindsay. I think he was gone. But anyway, that's besides.
In the second stint he was, but the first time you were in Detroit.
Yeah, maybe that. Sid Abel was already retired then. Must have been.
You played in the Western Hockey League in Seattle, which this is interesting. You played in one city, but for 3 different teams. First the Bombers, then they became the Americans, and finally the Totems. So let's start with this. This was between 1953 and 1969. What do you remember about the fan support in the 50s and 60s for your Seattle teams?
Well, in the early 50s, it was pretty slim. We didn't have a very big arena at that time in Seattle, and we probably got 3,500, 4,000 people, which wasn't a lot of people back then, but the salaries weren't that great either. But as we progressively went on and we won a championship in 58, 59, that kind of helped to perk up the fans in Seattle, and they started coming out. And then we moved into the Coliseum in 62, I believe it was, right after the World's Fair. And then we started getting a little more successful and winning some games, and we won 2 more championships. And once Seattle, if they like you, and as us in the sports, it don't matter which sport it is, they'll support you. And they're the greatest hockey fans I ever played for in my life.
You mentioned 1959, and that was your first championship season with the Totems. What are your memories of that team and winning a championship?
Oh boy, you're checking my memory now.
Well, that's
Well,
okay. I don't remember what I had for breakfast, so
well, it seems to me in that season we just barely made the playoffs, and we went along. We beat, I forget who it was, but in the finals we beat Calgary, and they were the biggest, strongest team. They walked away with the league championship all together. But we met them in the playoffs, and we beat them 4 straight, and it was just a combination of the type of players we had. There was only 15 players, I believe, at that time. We had 3 lines and 4 defensemen and a goalie. And if that adds up to 15, it should be pretty close. But we just all gelled together at the time, and things just went right, and we beat them quite handily. Great bunch of guys.
a year earlier in 1958, Punch Imlach tried to persuade you to join his Maple Leafs. What happened there?
Well, Punch came out to Seattle, and we sat down and talked for a couple hours, and he wanted me to go to Toronto for a tryout, and I said, well, listen, Punch, I'm just in the midst of being an apprentice for an electrician, and I just got started at this, and I'd like to have something to do when my career is over. Well, he said, well, you come on to Toronto and we'll work things out. I'll give you a 2-way contract. I said, wait a minute. No, I've been to the American League once, and I like it on the West Coast, and if I don't have the 1-way contract for Toronto, I'm sorry, I'll have to turn you down. So that's the way it happened.
Okay. Now, if I may embarrass you a little bit, 9 times you won the WHL scoring title with the Totems, including 4 straight between 1957 and 1960, and you were a 6-time league MVP. So here's another first that I found amusing. The Totems held a Guile Fielder night, but that was in 1960, and you'd play another dozen years. So why did they honor you with a night in 1960 when you weren't even close to retiring?
Well, I must have made a good impression on them, I guess. I don't really know the answer to that. But yes, they did. They gave me a night, and they also gave Rudy Fillion, who was just before me, and I played with Rudy. But they gave him a night also in Seattle. We were the only 2 players in hockey that I know of ever got 2 nights awarded to them. They sent me to Hawaii for 2 weeks, and they gave me a bunch of other gifts, a golf cart and fishing rods and a movie camera, a whole bunch of good stuff. Yep.
That's pretty good. Now, in 1963, in Vancouver, a team of WHL All-Stars played against the Maple Leafs in Vancouver. Do you recall playing in that game?
Oh, vaguely, yes.
Well, a sports writer said this about you. And remember, the Leafs were the defending Stanley Cup champs at the time, but the sports writer observed that you were the best player on the ice, and the Leafs had a number of future Hall of Famers. Did you ever feel like games like that were validation for you?
Oh, I don't know about that. I just enjoyed playing against them because I wanted to see how I'd fare against them with the team that I played with, not a bunch of National Leaguers. And we showed a pretty good situation, I guess, but I don't really remember the whole situation about that, but that was a long time ago. But I know we played against Detroit and Chicago and Toronto in different exhibition games and whatnot, and I think we did beat Chicago or somebody at one time.
Then in 1966-67, a season people have called the Guile Fielder Grand Slam. You were an all-star, again the scoring champion, were named WHL Most Valuable Player, and then the cherry on the sundae, the award for Most Gentlemanly Player as well. What a season. Tell me about it.
Well, it's just one of those things that turned out good for me. I always had some good teams to play with and some good wingers. And I had a good year. I don't know, I guess I won the scoring. I must have won the scoring, but that's the first in hockey, I believe, winning the Grand Slam, as far as I know, in any league. And I'm very impressed with that. And they have the trophy in the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto.
And the Totems captured the Lester Patrick Trophy. As you mentioned, you were league champions with the Totems 3 times.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the Western Hockey League champions. It's been a great season.
That year, 66-67, was the second time, and you would go on to win back-to-back titles. Were the Totems of that era a dominant team in the league?
Well, when Keith Allen retired and Bill McFarland took over as coach and general manager, he brought in some players that he figured we needed, some big, strong, tough defensemen. And we had a pretty good lineup of forwards, and we all seemed to gel pretty good. So I'll never forget the first series we played, or not the first series, but the last one we played in Seattle. We played against Portland, which was our nemesis all year long, and everybody else's too. We played, I think it was the first 2 games we played in Seattle. We lost the first game. No, we won the first game, just squeaked by. But the second game we were down 6-3 going into the third period, and we ended up winning it 7-6 in overtime. That's the greatest game I ever played in my life. Unfortunately, I got the game-winning goal, but then we went on to beat them 4 straight, and then the following year, the same thing more or less happened again. But Bill McFarland was responsible for that because he knew his hockey players, and he knew we were still affiliated with Detroit. So he talked to them naturally and got some players that were available, and they happened to work out just right.
3 times you won the Fred Hume Award, which is the WHL version of what the NHL calls the Lady Byng for gentlemanly play. How could you be so prolific offensively without being offensive in other ways?
Well, I was very fortunate. Like I said, I never had a weight problem, and I was always in good shape, and I had a good set of legs. And I didn't shoot the puck in the corners. I always tried to have the puck, and I controlled the game more or less. And nobody ever. I went in the corners like anybody else, but you don't go in first. You go in even with them. So I come out about the same. I never get hurt or whatever. So that's the best way I can explain it, I guess.
Opponents, though, would get aggressive trying to slow you down, but it usually didn't work. In fact, Totems executive Murray Costello observed this: the more you ran at him, the better he got. Did chippy play motivate you?
No, it scared the hell out of me. I didn't know whether I was going to get a good hit one night or not, but I prided myself in being in, like I said, good shape, and I was very elusive, and I had good peripheral vision, which you might say you can see to the sides and forward naturally. And I was fortunate. I was very agile, and I could get out of the way of most checks. But I did get hit a few times, but nothing real serious that I broke a leg or anything.
Costello also said you were actually somewhat shy and introverted off the ice, at least in the beginning. What was it about lacing up the skates that made you, in Costello's words, completely in charge?
Well, I don't know. When I put the uniform on, I had a job to do, I guess, and I just went out and did the best I could possibly do to help the team. And like I said, I was always in good shape, so Mind you, I did get hit a few times, but nothing real serious. But a lot of two-handers and stuff like that. I remember one year in the playoffs, we were playing against Victoria, I believe. And there was this one guy that I played against through my junior years and in pro, Bill Chevetz. So I had to have casts put on from my wrist up to my elbow on both arms because he gave me these two-handers and never call a penalty. So that's the one time that I do remember getting a little extra padding to try to protect my arms.
Your co-author, Van Tour, who's a hockey historian, also wrote, as much as we loved our hometown teams, Fielder transcended hometown loyalties. And one example I saw, there's a newspaper ad for an Edmonton Flyers home game against your Seattle Americans at the time. And it says in big type, Guile Fielder is coming to town. So were you aware you were selling tickets all over the WHL?
No, I didn't realize that. But what helped me there in Edmonton, they had the old rink. It had an extra big ice surface, so I had more room to work, and I really loved playing there, and I seemed to play pretty well there most of the time. So I loved going there.
Were there varying rink sizes around the league?
Oh, yes. The regular size, I believe, is 200 by 85, and I think that was about 210 or 15 long and probably 85 wide, but I had that extra length to maneuver around behind the net. You could almost play a game behind the net. There's so much room in there.
Yeah, I remember a certain 99, even with the 200 by 85, thought standing behind the net was a pretty good strategy.
Yeah, right.
Whenever we went into Edmonton, Guile Fielder said, we got in early in the morning. I headed directly for the pool hall right off the train. Tell me about that.
Oh, I loved going there. They had a nice billiard room, and I loved to play pool, and they always had some real good money games. So as soon as I got off the train, I head right to the pool room, excuse me, and played pool all day. Come 6 o'clock, I'd grab a cab and a hot dog and go to the rink and play, and then go right back to the pool room after the game and play more. Yeah, true story.
So actually, the hockey game interrupted what you were really trying to get done, which is play pool.
Well, you could say that, I guess, but I love both of them. But hockey was my main sport.
So you were good with a hockey stick, good with a pool cue. So it stands to reason you were also good with a golf club, right?
Oh, yes. That was probably my third favorite sport. But yes, I loved golf. I played a lot of golf. You bet.
How many holes in one?
5. And about 7 or 8 championships. In fact, I won the club championship in Broadmoor in Portland 7 years in a row. But that's going back a few years ago.
One of your coaches, Tom McVie, called you, quote, the most talented forward I've ever seen. And next to Bobby Orr, the best player by a country mile. And Don Cherry put it this way. He was a magician with the puck. He could fool you a dozen ways. Where did that skill come from? And was it natural? What did you work on? How did you become the magician that you ended up being?
Well, it must have been through my hard work at practice in Nipawin when I followed that punch to back. You know, like I said, he did that, stick handled and made plays and whatnot. And I prided myself in making plays because, like I said earlier, I don't have a very good shot. I'd always shoot the puck about glove high, and they'd catch them all the time. And sometimes I'd try to deke the goalie, but you can't always do that. So it's when it gets time to shoot, you shoot. But so I just worked hard at maneuvering my body and getting out of the way and making plays. I just love to make a nice play and the guy goes in and scores. I like to see that kind of. I wish they still do that today because right now I don't mean to talk the game down, but it's I love hockey, but it's certainly changed and the finesse of the game is gone. It's too bad.
One of your roommates with the Totems, Jim Powers, gave you a nice compliment, a different kind of compliment. He said that teammates, quote, drew inner strength, unquote, from you. Were you aware of that? And what do you think Jim was talking about when he said they drew inner strength from you?
Well, the only thing I can think of was my hard work ethic. I worked just as hard in practice as I did in games, and they, I guess, kind of took off from that. I don't really know the other reasons, but I'm happy to hear that. Jumbo is a good friend and an old winger of mine, but we've been friends for years, and he still lives in the Seattle area. We talk still once in a while, and I'm proud to and happy to hear that from Jumbo.
Your hockey nickname was, is this true, Tom?
Exactly.
Okay.
You
now,
know how that came in?
Tom's a fine name, but
You know,
as nicknames go, not a lot of pizzazz there, Guile.
well, you want to know how I got it?
Yeah.
In 1953-54, we were playing in Seattle, and there's a guy by the name of Vic Laufendahl. He was a defenseman, and he'd always play against me in practice. And, practice, you're always having scrimmages and whatnot. So somebody asked him one time, or no, he told me, he said, I think I'm going to start calling you Tom Fool. And I said, well, why is that? Well, he says, there's a racehorse named Tom, and Tom Fool, and I'm going to call you the same thing because it'd be damned if I can catch you. So that as it went on through the years, they always called me Tom Fool. Then it got broke down to just Tom, and everybody called me Tom after that. True story.
Since you are certainly nobody's fool, a Seattle Times sports writer, Hy Zimmerman, bestowed a better nickname on you, Golden Guile. And Zimmerman also wrote, a Zamboni would get 20 goals playing with Fielder. How much fun did you have over your career setting up teammates for goals?
Well, like I told you earlier, I prided myself in making plays, and once in a while I'd shoot, and I got a few goals, but I like to see different plays and, stick handle around somebody or deke them or whatever you might have to do to make a play. And that's just what I did, and I was fortunate to get away with it all those years.
Having said that about your prowess as a setup man, once in Vancouver, you read in advance of a game a newspaper story that said goal scoring was your weakness. What happened that night?
Well, excuse me. We went into Vancouver, and I guess, like you said, there was an article in the paper the day before, something about me not scoring any goals. I get all my points with assists. So we went into Vancouver that night, and we played against them, and Gump Worsley was in the net, and I scored 4 goals, and I think we won the game 4-3 or 4-0, something like that. And so I never got another, but I didn't know anything about the article, believe me. So, but it just turned out that way.
Come on. You didn't know? No one told you?
No, really, they didn't. No.
Okay. Being born in Idaho, as you mentioned, in 2020, you were nominated for the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame. And Kraken president Todd Leiweke, who we mentioned earlier, is the one who nominated you. And here's what Todd said on the application. Guile's exciting style of play captured fans' imaginations and ignited passion for our sport here in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest. How much of a link, Guile, do you feel to Seattle's new NHL team?
I don't know. I just wish them a lot of success and all the best to them. And they're going to have their great fans, like I said. And I'd like to have been there for the first game. There was a rumor going around that they was going to have me over to drop the puck in the first game, but somebody started this rumor. when the franchise first started, or when they knew they were getting a franchise. And it never came about, and I was a little disappointed in that respect. But I understand you're going to the National League, and I was just a minor leaguer, so they didn't take much about that because I was a minor leaguer. But other than that, I wish them all the best, and I thank Todd for those kind words.
Todd also called you a founding father on skates who helped make Seattle a hockey town. And at the end of each season, I understand, one Kraken player is going to receive the Guile Fielder Award each year for sportsmanship and leadership. It is nice to be remembered that way, at least.
Oh, for sure. They also have a locker room with all my old equipment on and the picture and everything about from the old days, but they're going to be there forever. And I won the scoring race 9 times, and I had a great big trophy about 4 feet tall, and I think it's going to be displayed somewhere in the new arena also.
I want to close our time together, which I thank you very much for taking the time. Is your friend Betty still nearby?
Yes.
All right. Well, have her come sit next to you. I'd like to talk to her for a second. This wouldn't have been possible without Betty.
You got that right. She's a smart lady.
She's your winger. Now, Betty, I want to ask you, we talked earlier about Guile's abilities with a pool cue. And tell me about the first time you met him. You had some friends who said you should go up to and talk to him, right? And that was in the pool hall at your retirement community?
Yes, I moved down here, and at that time my late husband was very sick and he passed away. And at that time I decided I really loved pool and I wanted to play pool. So the women I played with said, well, you know, that Guile Fielder over there, he's a really good pool player. And I go, who's he? But anyway, we decided, and I talked with him, and we decided that he cleaned tables every Saturday morning to get pool tables cleaned up. He said, well, if you come down Saturday morning while I'm cleaning pool tables, I'll teach you how to play pool. And he did a very good job. That's how we met.
Well, I heard the story just a touch differently. Apparently, people told you he used to be a hockey player.
Well, yes, that's true.
And do you remember what you said?
I said I didn't care. I didn't know anything about hockey. And I'm from Minnesota with the North Stars. But I never watched hockey until I met him. That's the truth.
Okay. Now tell me one more truth. Is he a hustler, or does he let other people win now and then?
He'll win anytime he can. He won't give anybody any. He won't even let me win just to let me win. You have to play. No, he doesn't. He likes to win, and he's not really a hustler. He just plays to the best of his ability.
Okay, but does anybody play for money?
Oh, he plays for money every day.
Why are they still playing with him?
Well, he plays snooker, and then he plays three-cushion billiards. And they play for the snooker, they play for $1, and the three-cushion, they play for a quarter. So it's not high stakes, but they play for money. It makes it more interesting. But I don't play those 2 games. I only play 8-ball and 9-ball.
And how good are you now?
Well, with his help, I'm pretty good.
Guile, do you ever wish you'd tried being Willie Mosconi or Minnesota Fats instead of a pro hockey player?
No, but I did play an exhibition game against Willie Mosconi in Seattle back in the late 50s, I guess it was, somewhere in there. And I enjoyed it. But pool wasn't all that popular back in those days, but it certainly is now.
All right. Well, Guile and Betty, you have been wonderful about sharing your time with us, and Guile, your memories, and Betty, the technical expertise to make this all happen. I thank you both so much for sharing your time with us, and we hope to see you up here again in Seattle so we can celebrate again the talents of Guile Fielder. Thank you both so much.
Great. Sounds good. Nice talking with you too, sir.
The great Guile Fielder. Thanks to him and to all of our guests tonight, and to you for sticking with us for the last 2 hours. We'll see some of you at the after party next. For everybody else, happy Festivus and good night.